quite that easy, but if you're wondering how to tackle Haslam drafting, join me now to see how I did it. Hello and welcome back to Atelier Limonova. I'm so glad that you're here today for the bit that we've all been waiting for, actually trying to draft something. If you followed my channel before, you'll know that I've been trying to master, and I'm hoping to master, the Haslam System of Dresscutting, and I'm documenting the process step by step. If you're discovering the system for the first time, my first video explores the historical background of the system and the basics of how it works. And in my second video, I break down the instructions for taking your measurements. I've linked these up above if you want to go back and look at these before we get started. The next step is going to be actually using those measurements to draft a slip pattern, and I've chosen this Haslam pattern from lingerie book number 8, which I hope is going to be fairly simple, and interestingly it doesn't actually require you to use the Haslam foundation. Instead, it uses my measurements to draft the slip pattern directly. So, without further ado, let's switch to drafting mode. Okay, so if you're brave enough to give this a go with me, you're going to need some pattern paper. You're going to need a sheet that's big enough to fit your whole pattern piece onto, and for that I really like this roll of craft paper because it's very sturdy and affordable. Sometimes I also need to be able to see through my paper to trace, and for that I like to use this Clairefontaine tracing paper which I found on Amazon. I keep a few rulers on hand, my meter stick, a standard 12-inch or 30cm ruler and a quilting ruler. I also have a sharp pencil to draw my lines, although I'll use a pen here so that you can see them clearly. And sometimes the patterns require you to cut and spread the pieces, so make sure you have some scissors and also tape that sticks well to the paper that you're using. Also, apologies for my last video in which I forgot to mention that you also need the Haslam Template, which looks like this. This is an original one, but if you don't have one, you can easily download one from Mrs. Depew on Etsy. Here you can purchase a full-size paper version of the template or an instant download PDF if you're in a hurry. I've bought a few draftings from Mrs. Depew in the past and I've always been really happy with my transactions. But don't blame me if you end up buying more than just the template, because I can promise you from personal experience that her selection of patterns is extremely enticing. And just one more thing before we get started. I've only used this system a couple of times before, so what you're about to see here is me learning as I go along. So if I seem to be verging on the style of a tutorial, well, that's just because I used to be a school teacher, but bear in mind what you're about to see is not necessarily the best way of doing things, but hopefully we can learn something useful together. Now, the first thing I do with these diagrams is try to identify the simplest shapes that I have measurements for. So I usually look for rectangles and label them when I know the dimensions. So if we start with the back, which is the simplest, here we have a rectangle where one side is 1/4 of the bust less 1/2 inch, and the other is the underarm length less 2 inches. For me, that's 38 divided by 4 minus the 1/2 inch, which is 9 inches. So we'll make a note of that here. And my underarm measurement less 2 inches is 8 inches. So we'll pop that on here. Then we do the same for the skirt. So given that this measurement is from the underarm to the waist, I'm assuming that this dotted line sits at the waist. So for the rest of this line, I'm going to put in my back skirt length. I've measured my shortest skirt and took off about 4 inches for my slip length, and that gives me 26 inches. So a total length of 34 inches down the back. When I came to the bottom edge, I was a little hesitant as the label doesn't seem to be on the bottom dotted line, but across the skirt panel. However, there's no precise indication of what height or angle to measure across at, and I'm taking a guess and hoping that this label actually refers to the bottom line. So I'm just going to put 15 inches for the end of this rectangle. Once I've figured out these key guidelines, I draft these onto paper using my long ruler. With the guidelines plotted, I've now come back to the drafting and I'm highlighting all of the small adjustments needed to plot the actual pattern lines. I find it easier to measure and mark these with my small ruler, and then I can use the longer ruler to join the straight lines. It's when you come to the curves that you'll need the Haslam template, and you'll notice that it's marked with letters and numbered corners. For traditional dressmaking, this is something that you might use French curve for. But with the Haslam system, all of the curves are built into this template, and I call it the Hovis template because I think it looks like a slice of bread. The template is marked around the edge with various letters and arrows, and the idea is to place the specified letter or corner to the indicated point. So in this case we need to line up K with the point at the top of the centre back, and then you can slide it into position until the curve reaches the point you're trying to join it to. From my experience, it can take a few tries to work out which way round it needs to go, but once you've got a curve that looks right, you simply draw around the edge. And we need to do the same thing at the bottom here, but this one requires corner 4 placed against the point to achieve the bottom curve. And this is the back pattern piece. I always label mine and make a note of any instructions, and if I've already added the seam allowance. I haven't here, so I'll make sure to note that so I hopefully don't make any mistakes later. If you're not already holding your pattern piece, then not to worry. I think this thing also has technical recap mode. There we go. First, I identify rectangles with known dimensions. Then, I label the diagram with these dimensions. I can then plot these key guidelines onto drafting paper. With the basic guidelines established, I apply the small adjustments needed to calculate the position of the final lines, using the Haslam template for the curves. Finally, I cut out the pattern piece and use as directed, remembering to add seam allowance. And the great thing about that setting, you could just rewind it and replay it as many times as you want to. So moving on to the front, the skirt follows the exact same principles that we've already tried, but the bodice section is just a little more complicated. Still, I'm starting in the same way as before by labelling the rectangles and plotting out the guidelines. Then for the bodice, I'm highlighting the adjustments again and plotting these points onto my guidelines. These should allow me to complete the lower piece of the bodice with curves B, C and E, and also to create the top point here using points K and E on the template. You can see on the picture that this part of the bodice is cut in one piece with the skirt panel and then seamed to the two cut pieces. This 1-inch wedge that I measured out is labelled cut away, so I'm going to cut along this line and then I can label up my second piece. This just leaves the bust cup section, which is marked open 1.5 inches on the dotted line that I drew earlier. This must be to add fullness for the little pleats or gathers on the front here. So on a clean area of paper, I'm going to take this piece, cut along the line, stopping just short of the edge, and then spread it open by 1.5 inches. I'm doing this on the tracing paper so you can see the grid measurements underneath, but you can also just measure it with a ruler. Once I've got that into position, I tape it down to the sheet underneath and cut around the whole thing to get my new piece. So now I have the back skirt piece from earlier. We have the front skirt panel coming up to the front here, and we have the front bust area. And I'll just use the technical recap mode so you can see that demonstrated again. So the front looks a little more intimidating than the back, but I followed the same process, and I'm going to concentrate on the bodice here as it's a little different. So I started by identifying the rectangles with known dimensions, and I labelled these. Next, I plotted these key guidelines onto the drafting paper. And then I plotted the adjustment dimensions and joined the lines using the template as indicated, one section at a time. This first lower bust section should be cut in one piece with the front skirt, and that's easy to draft by following the instructions for the back. With the lower portion taken care of, I continued plotting the measurements for the cutaway section and the shoulder point. Figuring out the dotted line across the centre was a little tricky as there was no measurement at the top, so I measured the 3¼ inches on the bottom and kept the line parallel with the line above it. This just left the bust section to be split and opened out by 1.5 inches. So the 3 finished pattern pieces should look something like this. So there you have it. That's my approach to drafting this slip, and I hope that you found it helpful. If you have any suggestions, any tips, any questions, then please leave them in the comments down below. I can't promise to be able to answer them all, but I really recommend joining the Haslam Sewing Support Group on Facebook. It's a really friendly and knowledgeable community of people all interested in or using the Haslam system, and there are a number of regular contributors who are much more experienced in using the Haslam system than me. You can ask questions or share your projects, and it's really great to meet others and get support to make your dream projects a reality. So, as always, thank you so much for being here today. It's really exciting to see how many people are joining me on this journey. And if you found the video useful and you think it deserves a like, then all of your clicks will be very much appreciated. And if you'd like to follow the next step on the journey, don't forget to subscribe and click the notifications bell, and then hopefully you should get an alert when the next video is ready. I will be sharing with you what happens with my mock-up of this pattern, and then hopefully the grand finale of this first series will present the finished slip. I had a wonderful suggestion from a member of the Haslam Sewing Support Group who suggested it might be fun to do a Haslam slip sew-along. So if you're interested, join the group on Facebook or follow me on Instagram and I'll keep you updated. I'm thinking probably I'll collect photographs of finished slips from anybody that would like to participate and feature them in the final video of the series, but I'll keep you posted. That just leaves me to say happy drafting to you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.